Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs Daily War Room Update. We are on day 82 of Israel's war with the Hamas genocidal terrorists in the Gaza Strip and all of their other genocidal terrorist friends. This is a war that started on the 7th of October with the massacre of 1,200 people and the kidnapping, taking hostage of hundreds more. After 82 days, the IDF forces are making considerable inroads into that terror infrastructure, which had really embedded itself entirely within Gaza, within the cities, within hospitals, within schools, underneath UN installations, in clinics, in every form of life and every place of life that could have been possible. The war started predominantly from Israel's side in the northern Gaza Strip, considered to be Hamas's stronghold, going into Gaza City, the surrounding areas, and also into the refugee camps, so-called refugee camps, Sajaiya and others. The fighting there has really produced quite frightening results, to tell the honest truth. The extent to which the terrorists had embedded themselves in the hospitals, in every single hospital. We have hospital directors who have now confessed to the fact that they were, in fact, Hamas operatives at the level of brigadier generals, and that the hospitals themselves served as not only as a base for the terrorists to act from, but also as a base which then received many of the hostages that were kidnapped on October 7. As of today, there are still 129 hostages being held by the terrorists in Gaza, not only by Hamas, but also by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a member organization of the PLO, a member organization of Mahmoud Abbas's so-called moderate Palestinian Authority. They're not moderate. Fatah itself, the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade, prides itself of having taken part actively in the October 7 massacre and in the war that has ensued. On the ground, the IDF forces have a pretty good stronghold in most of the northern Gaza Strip. Operations are now extending down south into also into Khan Yunis, also considered to be another stronghold of Hamas, and also into the area of Rafah, closer to the border with Egypt. The rockets keep on flying whilst the terrorists and their supporters, including, unfortunately, UN organizations like UNRWA, continue to cry that there's a ever-developing humanitarian situation, whilst food is running out, fuel is running out, water is running out. So they claim the rockets of the terrorists don't seem to be running out, and they keep on indiscriminately targeting Israel's civilian population. Nonetheless, there have been substantial efforts made by Israel, really conceding not a small amount in order to allow a tremendous amount of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip, both going through Egypt, through the Rafah crossing, and through Israeli crossings with the Gaza Strip. This is something which most of the press doesn't report, but really we're talking about hundreds of truckloads of food and fuel going into the Gaza Strip, ostensibly being delivered on the other side to UNRWA, this UN organization that's meant to be responsible for providing for the humanitarian needs. In effect, what we saw, according to a recording released by the IDF just yesterday, that the Gazan terrorists are taking over all of the humanitarian aid that is going into Gaza. They are depriving the civilian population of that aid. They are diverting it to their own military causes and for their close families and cohorts. And really, the average Gazan who isn't involved in the fighting isn't really enjoying the fruits of that aid. And unfortunately, what we have the situation is that UNRWA, this UN organization that's meant to be neutral, is really being played by Hamas, played by the terrorists, and is continuing with its quite vigorously to attack Israel instead of pointing the finger at the terrorists themselves. So that's the situation on the ground in Gaza. Further afield, obviously, we've following these different situations also on Israel's northern border. Today we saw a substantial barrage of rockets being fired by the other Iranian proxy, by Hezbollah, into Israel's north, targeting Rosh Hanikra and that whole northern area, with IDF forces then responding to the sources of those attacks. The Hezbollah, the terrorists in Lebanon, trying to explain that they're responding to the death of a civilian, but really what we're talking about is two terrorists that were Hezbollah terrorists that were actively involved in fighting, that were subject to attack, and the unfortunate death of one of the wives of one of those terrorists as an incidental, unfortunately, collateral damage to that attack. Hezbollah, obviously, there's no level of honesty there. We're talking about another homicidal, genocidal terrorist organization, just like Hamas, whose goal is the destruction of Israel, working on behalf of their masters in Tehran, and trying to implement that wider program. The Houthis in Yemen are continuing their aggression against the freedom of navigation, the access to the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, the Straits of Tiran, and continuing to interrupt the free passage of ships through the Suez Canal. International shipping companies continuing on with their objection to getting close to there, but at the same time, an international task force led by America, a multinational task force, has to be said, with some 90 warships taking part, really trying to provide freedom of navigation, which is so critical, not only for Israel, but also for the flow of goods from the entire Eastern Hemisphere through the Suez Canal, which is threatened, and thereby shortening the shipping and navigation trips instead of having to go all the way around the Horn of Africa. In Judea and Samaria, unfortunately, the terrorists there are active. It's the same Hamas. There is no difference between Hamas in Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip. They are continuing their activities, terrorist activities, continuously trying to carry out more terror attacks, and with IDF forces responding, arresting many of them. An incident, an unusual incident, that has to be said, yesterday in Tulkarem, with IDF forces even attacking from the air and targeting 6 terrorists and killing those terrorists whilst they were actively involved in acts of terrorism. In Israel, the situation within the Green Line, within the 1949 armistice lines, we're still seeing relative calm, and that seems to be the situation. So what we're going to discuss today is really a little bit of the day after in the Gaza Strip. We've discussed this before. Today we're joined by Yoni Ben Menachem, a veteran Arab and Palestinian commentator, and we've discussed this subject a little bit before, but now we're going to try and focus in on this idea of the American, rarely called, the US administration's call to bring in a revitalized Palestinian Authority to take some and play some type of role in the rehabilitation of the Gaza Strip once Israel obviously finishes the war and eradicates the terrorists. Because without having the time to eradicate the terrorists, then the terrorists will have won and everyone else will have lost, and they will have managed to survive carrying out the massacre and live to see another day. That's obviously not something which can be tolerated, either specifically with the Hamas terrorists, but also regionally. That would be a tremendous mistake for Israel and a general show of weakness, which would only open more opportunities for attack rather than provide any basis for extending a peace. So Yoni, thank you for joining us. Give us a little bit of an idea. We've seen President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, talking about this revitalized Palestinian Authority. Obviously, revitalized doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't say what needs to change. It doesn't say any benchmarks. it's a very fluid description of what's needed to be done. I would say that there are 5 criteria that need to be met even before we can discuss what a long-term revitalized Palestinian Authority would look like. First and foremost, the Palestinian Authority must immediately abolish its pay-for-slay policy. It must immediately recognize Israel as the Jewish nation state. It must immediately stop all incitement and education to hatred of Israel. These are things which have to stop immediately, because they are the ones who really provided the basis for the October 7 massacre. Fourthly, they must immediately stop the entire international assault on Israel on the international forums, in the UN, in the ICC, in the ICJ. That is not something that goes together with peace and coexistence. And finally, since the PA security forces are so heavily funded by the United States administration, even after the Taylor Force Act, that was the one derogation that America could continue funding the PA security forces, and they receive about $60 million a year in aid from the US for the security forces. Those security forces actually have to act against terror. I think that those 5 criteria are a starting point for what then could be considered as a revitalized Palestinian Authority. What from your sources, Yoni, what's being discussed with the Palestinian Authority?
Well, my friend, you forgot something very important, that the Palestinian Authority did not even denounce the massacre, the horrible massacre that happened on October the 7th. From that day until today, they just ignore it. So this is the immediate thing that they should do, is denounce this horrible massacre committed by Hamas, and Abu Mazen just ignores that. Let's talk about the Israeli position, as you described it very well. I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu, he made it very clear when he said that there is only one difference between the PA and Hamas. What is the difference? Hamas wants to kill us immediately, and the PA wants to do it gradually. So actually, the PA is still a terror organization headed by Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen. Now, there are some differences between the Israeli government and between the American administration. Joe Biden, the president, he helped us a lot during the war, and he has proven that he's a real friend of Israel. But there is a difference in the way we look, Israel government look at the PA, and the way the American administration looks at the Palestinian Authority. The American administration wants to preserve the PA as a hard core for a future Palestinian state in the future. And the Israeli government object the establishment of an independent Palestinian state, thinking that this is another stage of the PLO in its known plan as the stages plan, that first to take the 67 lines and then to destroy Israel in 48 areas. So this is a great difference between the two positions. Now, because the American administration wants so much to preserve the option of two-state solution, it seems that they're willing to ignore all the terrorist positions of the Palestinian Authority, and this is something that Israel cannot accept. So Israel is trying to find a solution, and also the Americans, they don't want to go into conflict with Israel about this issue of revitalize the PA. This is a very vague, like you mentioned, very vague term. Nobody knows exactly what it means. But Israel, as I said, doesn't want to go into a conflict with the United States. So the Prime Minister, he sent the Minister for Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, to Washington this week, and he met, according to press reports, he met with Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and with the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. And Tony Blinken will be arriving again into Israel next month. And so there is a dialogue going on between Israel and the American administration, trying to check this idea of revitalize the Palestinian Authority. As you mentioned, there are 5 conditions. I personally don't believe that nothing serious will come out of it, because we're talking about revitalized PA, but Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, is going to stay as the leader of the Palestinian Authority, even though he's 88 years old. He's not going anywhere. He doesn't want to give up his seat. Today, he said, this morning, he said to the Egyptian television that we are the Palestinians, we are the legal representative of the Palestinians, and we never gave up Gaza, and we want to control Gaza. So if Abu Mazen stays in office and he controls Gaza, I don't think that he will agree to change any of those subjects that you mentioned, and he will not agree to, for instance, stop the pay for slay method of paying the terrorists every month. He will not agree for a Jewish state. He will stay in his old position. So that means that we are in a deadlock. The question is how much pressure can the American administration put on the PA, and whether they want to do that. As I said, they want to preserve the two-state solution option, so they will not go into a confrontation with Abu Mazen, otherwise they will lose him. So I think that the situation is very complicated, and Israel and the American administration are trying to find a way to define what is exactly the revitalized Palestinian Authority.
I think here, Yoni, I think you're 100% right. I think we have a little bit of a dilemma. I think there are 2 different really factors that are being taken into account here. On the one hand, you have the personal factor. That's Mahmoud Abbas. His legacy, Mahmoud Abbas's legacy to the Palestinian people. Obviously, he's not dead yet, but if we can talk about his legacy while he's still alive, his legacy to the Palestinian people has been pay for slay. That is a law that passed after Arafat died, that Mahmoud Abbas personally pushed forward and has implemented, and he has raised time and time again the salaries that the PA pays to the terrorists. He's the one who has really led this idea of denying Israel's right to exist, the Palestinian school curriculum, if it was really possible, but it has actually happened, becoming more and more fanatical and more radicalized under his term as PA chairman. And he's also seen the PA security forces not only really traitorously avoiding their responsibility to fight terror, as they've been trained by the Americans to do, but rather using those forces as part of the onslaught on Israel and the terror activity. So you have that on the one side, you have this personal side. But I fear the problem is it's not personal. It's really not personal. This is something which is an institutional problem, which is really the second part of the equation, where I think the Americans are somewhat deluding themselves. It's easy, I think, to pretend that the problem is personal, that it's Mahmoud Abbas. And so if we get rid of Mahmoud Abbas, as you said, who's 88 years old, then we may obviously be in this new golden age of PA-Israel relations. I fear that is willful blindness until you really deal with the root problems that are the basis of the Palestinian Authority, this whole glorification of terrorists. Really the subjects that I mentioned before, including this, not only a personal, but an institutional condemnation, as you so rightly said, of the October 7 massacre. That's the problem. And yet the Americans seem to be playing on both of those fields. On the one hand, possibly saying, well, personally, he's not an option, but on the other hand, leaving this framework of the Palestinian Authority as a mechanism, as an institution, which they would now like to try and breathe new life into. How do you think that the Palestinians on their side, possible replacements for Mahmoud Abbas would be, how receptive would they be to those institutional changes that really have to be made?
Well, first of all, as a result of the reports of the media that the Americans want to have changes in the structure of the PA and revitalize the Palestinian Authority, what we hear from senior Fatah officials like Prime Minister Mohammed Ishtaya and Hussein al-Sheikh, the General Secretary of the PLO, is the closest person to Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen. What we hear from them publicly that they're rejecting completely all these American ideas. And they're saying that we are not going to agree to any changes in the structure of the PA. Now, what they're saying is that the only thing they're willing to accept is to train about 5,000 security personnel from the PA to train them in Egypt, in Jordan, for counter-terrorism. This is the only thing they're willing to do. But they say this is something legitimate, that they will improve the conduct of these security forces. But other than that, I don't think that they will agree for anything. And let's go for a minute for the possibility of Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen going down from the political stage. Who will replace him? There is a battle of succession in the Palestinian Authority, and the senior Fatah personalities who are competing to be the next PA chairman, they are all expressing very radical position in order to be accepted by the Palestinians. So, and the way I look at it, and I know these candidates personally, I think they're more extreme than Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen himself.
That's quite right on it. All of the names that have been discussed, and really we're talking about this day after Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, and the revitalized Palestinian Authority. I think what people have to understand is that one of the foundation stones of the creation of the Palestinian Authority was this ostensibly democratic process, that the Palestinian leadership would be chosen by the Palestinian people. Unfortunately, that was completely destroyed when in 2006, when Mahmoud Abbas, again, the same Mahmoud Abbas, with the assistance of the Americans and the international community, insisted that Hamas be allowed to participate in the Palestinian elections, even though they were a designated terrorist organization. And then Hamas won. And so since 2006, there haven't been elections in the Palestinian Authority. And so now you ask yourself, if you have, on the one hand, Hamas absolutely no longer exists, cannot participate in the elections, all you're left with really is really a fake democratic situation where you only have one party to elect, and that party's officials are in some cases people like Hussein al-Sheikh, who you mentioned before, the Secretary General of the Executive Committee of the PLO. He is a terrorist. This is a man who received two terrorists in his office on their way to carry out a terror attack. He then gave them.
Yeah, he spent 11 years in Israeli prison for terror activity.
Yeah, but for this he didn't stand trial. He gave these terrorists extra hand grenades and some money and sent them on his way. And he was those terrorists then went on to kill and murder Gad and Tzipi Shemesh in Jerusalem in an attack. It's an offense which he hasn't ever stood trial for, because most of the Palestinian leadership, whilst they were involved in terrorism, they managed to avoid arrest with few exceptions, like Marwan Barghouti. But he's a terrorist, and these other options, we saw Jibril Rajoub, who's one of these alternative options. constantly calling for more terror attacks, constantly calling for a joint mechanism of rulership together with Hamas. They don't see that moral negativity, really, for want of a better word, in including Hamas. They don't see Hamas as terrorists. They see them as legitimate actors in the Palestinian role. So how would that next group of leaders, if Mahmoud Abbas was to die today, how would that next group of PA leaders even be elected? What would they just impose some other despot or another?
They will not have general elections because the PA
Hamas would win.
Of course, the Fatah knows that Hamas will win, and also Israel knows that Hamas will win, and also the Biden administration and the European Union, everybody knows Hamas is going to win, so nobody is talking about elections. What the scenario that is expected is that they will convene the central committee of the PLO, and they will try to arrive to a consensus about a temporary leadership. Now, because there are so many differences and splits and disputes between the different candidates, the senior Fatah activists, who everybody sees himself as the potential successor of Mahmoud Abbas. So the idea now is to just divide the authorities of Mahmoud Abbas to three. One Fatah, senior Fatah activist will be appointed as the head of the PA. The other will be appointed as the head of the PLO, and another one will be appointed as the head of the parliament, the parliamentary council. And in this way, they will keep, everybody will have a piece of the cake, and there will be three personalities who will control the PA in different positions that now are, Abu Mazen is fulfilling all these three positions, but after we will die, this will be split, and we'll have three people controlling or succeeding Mahmoud Abbas. This is the plan. This way, they will refrain from a civil war in Judea and Samaria, and because every candidate that sees himself as the potential successor, every candidate like that have his own militia, armed militia, and if they will not come to an arrangement between them, there will be internal clashes, armed clashes between the different groups and between the different supporters of these senior Fatah officials. So in order to avoid that, and in order not to let Hamas take advantage of this situation, I think that they will split the authorities of Mahmoud Abbas among three people, and this way they will, until there will be general elections in the future, this will be a temporary arrangement to avoid conflicts and the civil war.
I mean, what that's really suggesting, Yoni, is that the international community support this idea of installing some type of dictatorial rule over the Palestinians, and that those dictators then be afforded the benefit of all of the international aid that flows into the Palestinian Authority. If under even this really shell of a democracy that existed there until now, you saw this widespread, really all-encompassing corruption within the Palestinian Authority, which is why, let's be honest, the Palestinians don't necessarily want to vote for Hamas, because they all necessarily identify with the genocidal, homicidal terrorists, but rather also because they're sick of the corruption, the nepotism, and really of the actions of Fatah. So
yeah, this is why the residents of Gaza Strip, they don't want the PA to come and rule Gaza, because they say these guys are going to steal all the money that will come in to renovate Gaza from the damages of the war. And
exactly, it's providing these people who have shown and proved themselves over 30 years to be entirely corrupt with this new source of massive potential income that the international community will rain on Gaza for its rehabilitation, ostensibly. And really we'll see this desperate situation where really nothing good happens for the Gazans, despite all the international aid. And you're left with this situation of a dictatorial rule that also won't be beneficial for them. And that's quite an indicting situation of the way you describe it.
Yes, actually the future is very gloomy, and I don't think that there is any signs of hope for the people in Gaza. On one hand, they are stuck with Hamas that brought atrocities on the Palestinian people in Gaza, because if it's also the massacre that they committed on October the 7th, they only brought atrocities. And today, even Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, he said that what is happening in Gaza is worse than the Nakba, the first Nakba in 1948. So on one hand, they have Hamas that brought them the Nakba, and on the other hand, they have the PA, which is corrupted, and is not going to do anything for the rehabilitation of Gaza Strip. This is what they suspect. So they are in the middle, and this is a tragic situation.
It really is tragic for the Gazans, because on the one hand, like you said, they have Abu Mazen, who in 2018 had no problem saying to Israel, the PA will no longer pay for the electricity of Gaza, for example, and that caused a massive cut in the amount of electricity that went to the Gaza Strip. He had no really compunction about punishing all of the Gazans for the rule of Hamas, and in that way to try and punish Hamas, but at the same time is embracing Hamas. And just a month and a half, 2 months before the massacre, Abu Mazen was in Cairo, in Egypt, discussing reconciliation with
in Algeria. In Algeria, he met with Khaled Mashal, with Ismail Haniyeh in Algeria, in order to have conciliation, but nothing came out of it.
This is something that they've been pushing for, and now their claim or their response to the Egyptian suggestion to go forward is that first Hamas must accept and become a member of the PLO, and therefore subjugate itself to the rule of Mahmoud Abbas or any other dictatorial rule, and only after that will they even discuss any type of potential role. So really, Abbas doesn't seem to care about the Gazans and their best interests. It just seems that all he's interested in is this power struggle with Hamas, who will lead the charge to destroy Israel.
Yes, look, the PLO and Hamas, or Fatah and Hamas, are like two parallel lines. They can never meet. They go parallel with each other, but they can never meet. The differences are so big. I think the strategy of Abu Mazen, if there will be pressure from the Biden administration, is to try and gain time, because the war is going to go for a few more months. These are the estimations, the military estimations, and because in order to have this revitalize the PA, you need to send this security personnel for training for at least 6 months. So he will try to gain time until after the elections in the United States, hoping that Joe Biden will not be reelected, and this way he will take the pressure off the PA to be revitalized or to be reformed as Joe Biden wants.
I think this idea of sending thousands of additional Palestinians for basically paramilitary training by Western countries in Jordan is a terrible idea. We've seen
they will teach them how to be new terrorists.
Yeah, we've seen these forces being trained before. They're just part of the terrorist army, and really sending another 5,000 or however many thousand to be trained would just strengthen this terrorist army that's being built by Fatah, PA, PLO against Israel, and would serve no purpose whatsoever to fight terror. Surely that's an understanding that even the American administration has.
Yeah, look, I'll give you an example. the PA now has about 40,000 security personnel who carry weapons. And yet they lost all the security control of the north of the West Bank, the north of Samaria. Why did they lose that? Because they don't want to fight terrorism. They have 40,000 armed people. They could have crashed the terrorist groups in the north of Samaria, but they don't want to do that. This is a political order from Abu Mazen not to crack down on these terror groups. So we'll have another 5,000 armed Palestinians who are trained in fighting terrorism, but they will not do anything because this is a political decision, and Abu Mazen does not want to fight terrorism.
Already before we started hearing widely about the Lion's Den terrorist organizations and that loss of control in Jenin and indeed in most of Samaria. I wrote an article about the fact that those people, the terrorists who were actually walking the streets in these cities, they weren't Hamas terrorists, they weren't Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They were actually terrorists from the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades. That's a part of Fatah, and that really showed the reticence of Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority, to fight against them, because these are they don't see them at all as terrorists. They see them as part of the Fatah mechanism, and they were the ones who were leading the terrorism. They were the ones who were leading the change there. So really providing more forces that are well trained to the Palestinian Authority to do exactly what they haven't done until now, I think would be a complete oxymoron. Moreover, what we saw, as I mentioned, one of the subjects that really has to be one of the fundamental benchmarks for before we even start talking about the revitalized Palestinian Authority is canceling the pay for slave program. Now, what we saw a while ago is Mahmoud Abbas trying to do everything he could to hide those payments. As part of that program, he even allowed, condoned, approved the induction, the recruitment of ex-terrorists into the security forces. The terrorists were actually now those charged with fighting terrorism. That's what Mahmoud Abbas did. And so when you send these people out now to go and be retrained or better trained, they themselves are potentially terrorists that would just be upgraded. How is that even a possibility, Yoni?
Just imagine those between 1,000 to 3,000 terrorists who committed the horrible massacre in the communities on the border with Gaza. Those who are alive and those who are dead, their families will get the money. So is this logical that the terrorists that committed this massacre will be paid now by the PA? Because the PA, they pay also terrorists of Hamas. They don't only pay the terrorists of Fatah or PFLP or DFLP. They pay everybody. Any Palestinian who killed Jews, they pay him money, and if he's dead, they pay his family.
That's really one of those fundamentals that have to be understood. Just a question from one of our audience, Yoni, before we close. To what extent do you give credit, or how would you evaluate the Egyptian suggestion for the continued rule of Gaza? Is this just something that's really designed to put the PA in an awkward position, put Fatah in an awkward position, put the PLO in an awkward position, Hamas in an awkward position? Because that firstly, if you could just expand a little bit on the Egyptian suggestion, and then understand where it's going.
The Egyptian, they want a reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas. The Egyptians themselves, they tried for many years to make this reconciliation, and they failed. Not only them, other Arab countries also failed. As I told you, these are two parallel lines that can never meet. But they want to show the Arab world and the Palestinians that they are pushing for a Palestinian unity, which can never happen. So I think that they know that it's not relevant, and no side is going to accept the suggestion. Not the Fatah doesn't take it seriously, and the Hamas don't take it seriously, and just a show of unity to the Palestinians and to the Arab world.
And so just a last question, Yoni, moving forward. When Israel, when Minister Dermer engages with the State Department, engages with Jake Sullivan, and they're discussing this revitalized Palestinian Authority, would you suggest to go in the direction that we went in Oslo, and suffice with general commitments to do something in the future, or B, demand that there be concrete actions taken already initially to start down this process? Because we've seen more times option A being adopted, and in my understanding completely failing to this day, but it seems to be a recurring occurrence.
If I could give an advice to the political echelon in Israel and to Prime Minister Netanyahu, because Minister Dermer is only the messenger, I would suggest that Israel will try to convince the American administration to have Arab rule in Gaza Strip, not Palestinian rule, Arab rule. Some sort of a council from the Emirates, from Saudi Arabia, from Egypt, Arabs that will control the daily life in Gaza. Because any Palestinian that you put there is going to be hostile towards Israel. There are no moderate Palestinians in Gaza. This is a rule, ground rule. You will never find one Palestinian who is moderate and doesn't want to be, who wants to be have peace with Israel. All of them are fanatic extremists, whether they're from the Fatah or from Hamas. So if we have a Palestinian entity, some sort of an entity that will rule the Gaza Strip, it will be hostile towards Israel. So I think that Israel should convince the American administration to have an Arab rule in Gaza and not a Palestinian rule.
Without a doubt, the dangers and fears of an immediate Palestinian rule after, again, the way that most of the Palestinians have been educated over the last 30 years is, I think, at least clear to Prime Minister Netanyahu and to the Israelis. I just hope that it's as clear to the Americans and to the international community that you cannot really deal with that situation of complete hostility. And what really does need to be implemented is some type of process of denazification, similar to the programs that were implemented in Europe and in Japan after the Second World War. But that's obviously something which we need to discuss on a much more wider level as to what exactly that type of a program would look like. And that's something which the JCPA, the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, is looking into, is discussing, also with other organizations, with regional partners, and with discussions with the relevant people in Israel's government, we hope. And so that's something which we'll have to discuss a little bit further down the line. Yoni, thank you for your insights, your context, as ever. We will say goodbye for today. We will be back tomorrow at 4 o'clock Israel time, and we hope to see you again. Please, in the meantime, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again.